quiet archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in, let the outside world dissolve, and gently descend into tonight's world. The Bob Lazar story is often presented as a single dramatic claim, but most of the debate is not about one detail. It is about a long chain of specific assertions and whether they hold up under basic checks. Education records, employment history, dates, documents, witnesses, technical statements, and how those pieces change over time. In this episode, the focus stays on evidence that debunkers repeatedly cite and the outcomes that follow from each issue. Some points are strong, some are uncertain, and some remain unresolved because records are missing or disputed. The goal is to lay out the main problems one after another in plain language, so the listener can understand what is claimed, what counter-evidence exists, and what conclusion is reasonable based on what is actually verifiable. Tonight, we debunk the Bob Lazar story. Bob Lazar is a name that sits at the center of modern UFO culture. For decades, his story has been retold in documentaries, podcasts, and internet threads. The basic outline is familiar. He says he was hired to work at a secret site near Area 51. He says he was taken to a location often called S4. He says he saw craft that were not made by humans. He says he worked on propulsion. He says the power source involved a stable form of element 115. He says he tried to go public because he feared for his life. Many people find the story compelling because it feels detailed. It includes places. It includes procedures. It includes security briefings. It includes a test flight schedule. It includes technical language. And it includes an emotional core. A man claiming the state is hiding the biggest discovery in history. Debunkers approach it differently. They do not start with the craft, they start with the paper. If a person claims a specific education and a specific job history, those claims should leave traces. Not all traces survive. But in a case as public and repeated as this, the absence and the contradictions become part of the evidence. So tonight, the structure is simple. One issue at a time. Claim, counter-evidence, outcome, and then we move to the next. Issue 1 is the foundation. Lazar's education claims. The claim. Lazar has said he attended MIT. He has said he attended Caltech. He has described degrees and timelines in ways that, if true, would place him in elite academic programs. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. MIT and Caltech do not have verified records of him graduating. There are no publicly verified transcripts. There are no verified yearbook entries. There are no known classmates who can independently confirm being in the same program at the same time, in the way that typically happens when someone is publicly checked. People can lose records, schools can make mistakes. But the core issue is that elite programs tend to produce a trail of references, and in this case, the trail is weak. Debunkers also point to the way Lazar describes details of his schooling, saying it often sounds generic, not like someone recalling a demanding engineering curriculum. The outcome. The education claims remain unverified in the public record. That does not prove the rest of the story is false, but it weakens the credibility baseline. If the education claims cannot be confirmed, then the listener has to ask whether other parts of the biography are also overstated or altered. Issue 2 is connected. The Los Alamos link. The claim. Lazar has said he worked at Los Alamos National Laboratory or around it. He has been presented as a physicist with a serious technical job history, the counter-evidence debunker's site. There is evidence Lazar was in the area and associated with Los Alamos in some way. Debunkers often acknowledge that this part is not pure invention, but they also point to the way contractors work. Being at a lab does not always mean being a staff scientist. It can mean being a contractor, a technician, or doing support work. Some records and comments in public discussion suggest Lazar may have worked through a contractor rather than as a lab physicist. The outcome. The Los Alamos connection provides a partial anchor for Lazar being near real high-security science, but it does not automatically support the claim that he was selected for reverse engineering alien propulsion. It is consistent with a more ordinary explanation. Someone connected to technical work, who later expands the role in retelling. Issue 3 is one of the most cited. The problem of documents and identity. The claim. Lazar says he was recruited into a very secret program. He implies he was officially cleared and officially employed. He has said the government erased his records. The counter-evidence debunker's site. Debunkers argue that the erasure explanation is a common escape hatch. If records are missing, the story says the missing records are proof of the cover-up, but that makes the claim hard to test. More importantly, debunkers point out that some traces would be hard to erase completely. If a person attended MIT and Caltech, they would likely have classmates, professors, and social ties. If a person was a staff physicist, they would likely have colleagues who could confirm at least the existence of the person in that role. The outcome. The erasure claim is not falsifiable using ordinary public methods, so debunkers treat it as a narrative device rather than evidence. Issue 4 is the timeline and how the story changes. The claim. Lazar has told his story in interviews over many years. The core is consistent: S4, craft, propulsion, element 115. The counter-evidence debunker's site. In many long-lived stories, details drift. Debunkers point out alleged changes in Lazar's wording, the way some technical statements become more polished after the fact, and the way some specific claims appear after the story is already famous. They also point to differences between early interviews and later documentaries. The outcome. Even honest witnesses can change details over time, but in a story that relies heavily on credibility, shifting details increase skepticism. Issue 5 is the S4 location, the claim. Lazar says S4 exists as a hidden facility near Papoose Lake. He implies it is part of the Area 51 ecosystem, the counter-evidence debunker's site. Debunkers note that S4 is not a publicly confirmed name for a facility at that location. They argue that the name may have been borrowed from other contexts, including other military labeling practices. They also argue that claims about a specific hidden hangar built into a hillside require physical corroboration that has not been provided. At the same time, debunkers acknowledge that the general region contains classified sites and ranges, so the problem is not that secrecy is impossible. The problem is that Lazar's specific description is not verified. The outcome. S4 remains an unconfirmed claim in public evidence. It is a key element of Lazar's narrative, but it does not have independent public validation. Issue 6 is the test flight schedule and the famous viewing trips. The claim. Lazar has described a schedule of test flights. He has said he brought friends to watch lights or craft in the sky. This part is often used as supporting evidence. Multiple witnesses watched something. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers argue that lights in that area can have many sources: military aircraft, flares, training exercises. They note that the public does not have a confirmed record linking those nights to alien craft tests. They also note that the claim is compatible with witnessing ordinary classified aircraft tests. The outcome: the viewing trips may be real in the sense that people went and saw something, but they do not uniquely support the conclusion that Lazar was watching alien craft. Issue 7 is the propulsion description. The claim: Lazar describes a gravity-based propulsion system. He uses language about bending gravity or creating a field. He describes a reactor-like device. He describes a craft flying belly first. He describes different modes. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers argue that much of this language is vague and matches popular science concepts that were already in culture. They point out that gravity manipulation is a common science fiction trope. They also argue that Lazar's technical explanations do not include the kind of specific engineering detail that would be expected from someone who truly worked hands-on with a revolutionary system. In addition, they point to moments where Lazar uses terms that sound impressive, but are not used in that way in mainstream physics. The outcome: the propulsion claims are not strongly testable using public data, but debunkers argue the explanations are not convincing as expert technical reporting. Issue 8 is element 115. The claim: Lazar says the craft used a stable form of element 115. He implies he had access to it. He implies he could describe its effects. He implies it was central to the technology. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Element 115 exists as a synthetic element that was later named moscovium, but the stable island Lazar implies is not demonstrated. Debunkers argue that Lazar's use of the element is not supported by any verified sample or published analysis. They also point out that naming an element number is not a uniquely predictive claim. The periodic table will always reach new numbers, so the later creation of element 115 does not prove Lazar had secret knowledge. The outcome: element 115 is a strong branding piece in Lazar's story, but it is not a verified evidence point in the public record. Issue 9 is the hand scanner. The claim: Lazar described a hand-bone scanner device used for security. This detail is often remembered because it is concrete. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers point out that similar devices were known or shown in popular media. They also note that security devices in military contexts can be real, and descriptions of them can be learned second-hand. So the scanner detail does not uniquely prove Lazar was inside the most secret program. The outcome: the hand scanner is memorable, but it is not decisive evidence. Issue 10 is how Lazar was introduced to the public. The claim: the original story circulated through interviews and a public advocate. Lazar has said he was encouraged to speak and that he feared retaliation. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers focus on the incentive environment. A sensational story creates attention. Attention can create money, influence, and identity. They argue that the story has been monetized and kept alive in ways that are not consistent with someone trying to stay safe. They also point to inconsistencies in how Lazar describes his motivation. The outcome: motives are hard to prove, but the public record shows that the story became a long-term media product. That does not automatically prove it is false, but it changes the context. Issue 11 is the role of George Knapp and secondary witnesses. The claim: Supporters often point to journalists and interviewers who believed Lazar. They point to the idea that serious people would not back a hoax. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers say that believing a witness is not the same as verifying a claim. A journalist can be convinced by a person and still be wrong. They also point to the fact that many supporting voices cannot independently confirm the central claims, only the act of Lazar telling the story, the outcome. Secondary support can increase confidence in Lazar as a person, but it does not automatically confirm the existence of alien craft. Issue 12 is the employment paper trail. The claim. Lazar implies he had a legitimate employment relationship tied to the program. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers point to gaps and contradictions in pay stubs, W-2-style documents, and the way employment is described. They argue that the documentation that has been shown publicly does not match the strongest form of a verified employment record. They also point to the possibility of contractor arrangements that would not look like direct employment. The outcome. This point remains disputed in public discussion. It does not clearly prove Lazar lied about being in the region, but it does not strongly support the extraordinary job claim. Issue 13 is the claim of multiple craft. The claim. Lazar has said there were multiple craft at the facility. He has described numbers and types. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers argue that this kind of detail is easy to invent and hard to verify. They also argue that if multiple non-human craft existed in US custody, the scale of the program would be massive and would likely produce leaks beyond a single witness. The outcome. The multiple craft claim remains unverified. Issue 14 is the story of reading briefing documents. The claim. Lazar has said he read documents about aliens and history. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers note that these document stories often include dramatic but unverifiable content. They also note that in truly secret programs, access is usually compartmentalized. A newcomer is often not given sweeping historical briefings. The outcome. The briefing document claim is treated by debunkers as a narrative flourish, rather than a verified point. Issue 15 is the question of technical outcomes. The claim. If Lazar worked on propulsion, he should have learned unique technical details. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers argue that decades later, Lazar has not produced a clear, testable technical statement that would demonstrate privileged access. They say that the story contains many assertions, but few predictions that can be checked. The outcome. For debunkers, the lack of testable output is one of the strongest reasons to doubt. Issue 16 is the broader pattern of UFO storytelling. The claim. Supporters sometimes argue Lazar is one of many whistleblowers. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers point out that UFO culture has repeated patterns: secret bases, erased records, mysterious materials, and government intimidation. They argue Lazar's story fits these patterns too well. The outcome. Pattern matching is not proof, but it adds weight when combined with other credibility problems. Now add one more category: specific debunk claims that are often listed rapidly in discussions. These are not all equally strong, but they appear again and again. Debunk point. Lazar's background includes controversial business activity. Claim. Lazar has been associated with businesses and events that critics use to question character. Counter-evidence. Supporters argue that personal issues do not disprove a technical claim. Outcome. Personal history does not settle the craft question, but credibility is part of how audiences judge extraordinary claims. Debunk point. The story depends heavily on Lazar as the single central witness. Claim. He is the main voice. Counter evidence. Supporters cite friends and journalists. Outcome. No independent confirmation of the core alien technology has surfaced publicly. Debunk point. Key claims can be explained by ordinary secrecy. Claim. Lights near Area 51. Counter evidence. Military tests can explain lights. Outcome. The evidence does not uniquely point to alien craft. At this point, the listener can step back and ask a practical question. If the story were true, what would the world look like? There would likely be more than one leak. There would likely be physical samples. There would likely be consistent documents. There would likely be more verifiable witnesses. The fact that this has not happened in a strong public way is part of why debunkers conclude that the story is not reliable. But there is also an honest limit. Secrecy is real. Classified programs exist. Records can be incomplete. Some information can be hidden. So the best conclusion is not absolute certainty. It is a weighted judgment. On one side, the story is extraordinary and specific. On the other side, the public record shows repeated credibility problems, missing confirmations, and many claims that are not uniquely supported by evidence. So the debunker position is usually this. Lazar may have been around real classified environments. He may have seen real tests. He may have built a story around that. But the claim that he worked on alien craft propulsion at S4 is not supported by verifiable public evidence. Now, to keep the narration calm and useful, end with the same direct map. The main issues debunkers cite are education claims not verified, employment claims disputed, erased record claim not testable, S4 not publicly confirmed, Element 115 claim not supported by verified samples, technical descriptions vague, witness structure weak, alternative explanations exist for observed lights, and the story fits known UFO narrative patterns. That is the evidence chain as it appears in public debate. If new evidence ever appears, the judgment can change. A verified document, a verified sample, a confirmed facility, a confirmed engineering detail. But until then, the most careful outcome is skepticism grounded in specific issues, not in mockery. Now we slow down and go through more of the specific issues that show up in debunker write-ups, because the strength of the critique is not one silver bullet. It is the accumulation of many smaller failures. Issue 17 is basic biography consistency. The claim. Lazar presents himself as a physicist with elite training, who moved smoothly into a classified world. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. They point out that biographies tend to have stable anchors: schools, dates, supervisors, published work, classmates, and a clear progression. In Lazar's case, the anchors are weak or disputed. The education claims are not confirmed. The job path is not clean. And the narrative of sudden recruitment depends heavily on Lazar's own account. The outcome. This does not directly disprove the S4 claim, but it makes the story depend on trust at the exact points where trust is hardest. Issue 18 is the question of why Lazar would be selected. The claim. Lazar suggests he was recruited to solve a problem that top scientists could not. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers argue that truly extraordinary reverse engineering programs would recruit from known elite pools. They would draw on people with a documented track record. They would not normally rely on a person whose academic history cannot be verified. They also argue that such programs would be staffed with multiple levels of expertise, and that the work would be heavily compartmentalized. The outcome. The recruitment story is plausible in a movie sense, but debunkers argue it is not plausible in the way real institutions usually behave. Issue 19 is the content of Lazar's technical talk, the claim. Lazar often uses physics language to frame his story. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers say that a real technical report from a hands-on program would include clear boundaries. What was measured, what was observed, what was attempted, what failed, what was unknown. They argue Lazar tends to give conclusions without the measurement steps. He says what the system does. He rarely gives the raw engineering constraints. They also point out that some of his statements sound like simplified popular explanations, rather than lab notebook-style descriptions. The outcome. For debunkers, the technical speech increases doubt, because it feels designed to sound technical without committing to testable specifics. Issue 20 is the question of independent corroboration. The claim. Supporters often say that Lazar has been consistent and that others have backed him. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers separate two kinds of support: support of the person and support of the claim. A journalist believing Lazar is support of the person. It is not, by itself, independent support of the craft. A friend saying Lazar went to the desert is support of a trip. It is not independent support of the origin of the lights. Debunkers argue that after decades, the lack of a truly independent witness to the core program is the central weakness. The outcome. The story remains a single-source claim about an extraordinary subject. Issue 21 is the role of existing public knowledge. The claim. Lazar includes specific details that people find convincing. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers argue that many of these details were already in circulation. Area 51 secrecy was already known. Advanced aircraft testing was already suspected. Security scanners existed. Science fiction and popular science already used gravity manipulation language. So they argue that the story can be constructed from existing cultural material plus real secrecy. The outcome. The presence of plausible details does not guarantee privileged access. Issue 22 is the claim that Lazar possessed element 115. The claim. At times, Lazar has implied he had a sample. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers point out that no verified sample has been presented for independent testing. They argue that if Lazar truly had a piece of a revolutionary fuel, the strongest move would be to provide a small sample for analysis. They also argue that if the state were as aggressive as implied, keeping a sample would be extremely risky. The outcome. Without a verified sample, the element 115 claim remains a story element rather than an evidence element. Issue 23 is the way the story interacts with legal and practical reality. The claim. Lazar implies he was in a world of extreme secrecy, threats, and surveillance. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers argue that people in truly sensitive programs are constrained by clear legal frameworks. They are monitored. They are debriefed. They are often controlled through contracts, not only through vague intimidation. They also argue that if Lazar had truly breached the most sensitive secret imaginable, the consequences would likely be more direct than the story suggests. The outcome. The threat narrative is compelling, but not verifiable. Issue 24 is the S4 physical description. The claim: a hangar built into a hillside, multiple craft-specific procedures. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers note that dramatic physical claims should eventually be testable in some way, even indirectly. Repeated satellite imagery, consistent accounts from multiple sources, a map that matches known terrain. They argue that these have not converged into a strong public confirmation. The outcome: S4 remains a claim, not a verified location. Issue 25 is the question of what Lazar actually witnessed. The claim: he claims direct access to alien technology. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers propose a different outcome. Lazar may have been exposed to real classified aviation tests and built an interpretation around it. He may have heard rumors. He may have been fed a story. Or he may have constructed a story to explain what he saw. They argue that classified aircraft testing can create the same impressions: unusual lights, restricted roads, security, and secrecy. The outcome: a mundane, classified explanation can fit many observations without requiring alien craft. Issue 26 is the consistency of the element 115 explanation with known physics. The claim: a stable super-heavy isotope that enables gravity control. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers point out that super-heavy elements are generally unstable. Creating a stable isotope would be extraordinary. And even if it existed, the leap from a heavy element to controllable gravity is not supported by known physics. They argue Lazar's explanation does not bridge the gap with real, checkable reasoning. The outcome: the element 115 story functions more like science fiction than like a technical report. Issue 27 is the problem of why no clear artifact exists. The claim: if the US had multiple craft, there would be material and machinery. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers argue that extraordinary programs leak. They leak through people. They leak through budgets. They leak through procurement. They leak through physical leftovers. The longer the timeline, the harder it is to contain. The outcome: the absence of hard artifacts in public is not final proof, but it is a strong weight against the claim. Issue 28 is the culture around Lazar. The claim: supporters often treat Lazar as a martyr or a pioneer. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers argue that the story is protected by identity. If you believe Lazar, you become part of an in-group. If you doubt him, you are cast as naive or captured by authority. This social structure can keep weak evidence alive. The outcome: the story persists partly because it is culturally useful, not only because it is evidentially strong. Now, because you asked for evidence one after another, we can list a set of common debunk points in a tighter, more direct format. Point A. Claim: Lazar graduated from MIT. Counter: no verified record of graduation. Outcome: credibility reduced. Point B. Claim: Lazar attended Caltech. Counter: no verified record. Outcome: credibility reduced. Point C. Claim: Lazar was a physicist selected for elite reverse engineering. Counter: unclear academic and professional trail. Outcome: selection story doubtful. Point D. Claim: Lazar's records were erased. Counter: erasure is not testable and does not create positive evidence. Outcome: does not strengthen the claim. Point E. Claim: S4 exists at Papoose Lake as described. Counter: not publicly confirmed, no independent verification. Outcome: core location remains unverified. Point F. Claim: element 115 was the fuel. Counter: no verified sample. Later discovery of element 115 does not confirm Lazar. Outcome, story element, not evidence. Point G, claim, technical details prove insider knowledge. Counter, details match existing cultural material and remain vague. Outcome, not decisive. Point H, claim, desert viewing trips confirm the story. Counter, lights can be conventional tests. Outcome, ambiguous. Point I, claim, threats prove a cover-up. Counter, threats are not independently documented. Outcome, not evidence. Point J, claim, multiple craft existed. Counter, no artifacts and no multiple independent insiders. Outcome, unverified. Now add a more complete, evidence-first walkthrough that many debunkers emphasize when they explain their conclusion. First, if the story begins with elite training, the training should be verifiable. It is not. Second, if the story continues with elite employment, the employment should be verifiable. It is disputed and unclear. Third, if the story involves a specific hidden facility, the facility should leave some trace. It has not been confirmed. Fourth, if the story involves a revolutionary material, a sample would be the strongest evidence. A sample has not been verified. Fifth, if the story involves multiple craft and many staff, more than one person should eventually leak meaningful details. The public does not have that. So the debunker outcome is not built on one argument. It is built on this chain. The story asks for maximum belief at every step where evidence is weakest. Now, if we want to be fair, we should also name what debunkers typically admit. They admit that US classified programs exist. They admit that the Nevada test ranges are real. They admit that lights and unusual aircraft tests have occurred. They admit that someone can be involved in technical work without being a top physicist. So the debunker position does not require Lazar to be a complete invention. It only requires that the extraordinary parts are not supported. Now, to reach a long-form, matter-of-fact structure without fluff, we can add another full case file that often accompanies Lazar in debunk discussions. The case file is the general history of how UFO claims are packaged. A dramatic claim is made. A lack of evidence is explained as the result of secrecy. Any missing records are treated as erasure. Any doubt is treated as naive. The story becomes a permanent product. Over time, the story becomes familiar, and familiarity feels like truth. Debunkers treat Lazar as a textbook example of this mechanism. They argue the details serve storytelling rather than verification. They argue the strongest evidence points are not the alien parts, but the ordinary secret world parts. If that is correct, the outcome is simple. Lazar may have used a real secret environment to build a story that sounds plausible. And because the environment is truly secret, it is hard to fully refute. So the story survives. Now add another evidence category. Why the story remains attractive even when criticisms are known. It offers a clear villain, the government. It offers a clear hero, the whistleblower. It offers a clear object, the craft, and it offers a clear key. Element 115. This is a complete narrative. It is easy to remember. It is easy to repeat. It is easy to defend. But ease is not truth. Now, if you take only one takeaway tonight, let it be this. If you want to believe Lazar, you should be able to state the strongest verifiable evidence point in one sentence. Not a feeling, not a vibe, a verifiable point. Debunkers argue that this cannot currently be done for the central alien technology claim. And until it can, the most reasonable outcome is that the story is not proven and is likely exaggerated or false in its extraordinary parts. Now we add a second long section that debunkers often use as the decisive weight. It is the work done by investigators who tried to verify Lazar's story in the most boring way possible, not by arguing about aliens, by checking records, by comparing dates, by looking for ordinary traces. One of the most cited investigators in this category is Stanton Friedman. You do not need to agree with all of Friedman's views to understand why his Lazar work is used. He took Lazar's claims as claims that could be tested. He asked for basic confirmation, and he reported that he could not confirm the most important education and employment assertions. Debunkers point to that as a core outcome. An experienced investigator did not find the expected trail. Now, because the listener may not know the details, we can list the common verification attempts and what they found. Verification attempt 1. Find classmates. If a person went through MIT or Caltech in a specific program, there should be people who remember him. Debunkers report that the normal kind of confirmation did not occur. There are stories of 1 or 2 people being suggested, but not a strong, independent cohort. The outcome: the education claim remains unverified. Verification attempt 2. Find thesis or published work. Elite programs, especially in technical fields, often leave traces. Theses, project work, departmental records, or references. Debunkers argue that no clear, verified academic output exists for Lazar at those schools. The outcome: the claim remains unsupported. Verification attempt 3. Check employment at specific organizations. Lazar has been linked to Los Alamos. Debunkers often accept that he had some relationship in that environment. The disputed part is the role. Staff scientist versus contractor. Physicist versus technician. Debunkers point out that the difference matters because the claim of being recruited for alien reverse engineering depends on being at the top of the technical ladder. If the role is a contractor support role, the recruitment story becomes less plausible. The outcome: Los Alamos is a partial anchor, not a confirmation. Verification attempt 4. Check the timeline of the story entering public media. Debunkers emphasize that the story gained power through repetition. Once a story is public, it becomes harder to untangle what was known first and what was learned later. If someone keeps telling the story, they also have decades to refine it, patch weak points, and adopt language that makes it sound more coherent. The outcome: later consistency is not the same as early verification. Now, some debunkers go further. They argue that Lazar has a pattern of embellishment. This is where personal history enters, not as moral judgment, but as a credibility factor. If a person has a history of exaggeration or questionable claims in other areas, it changes the prior probability that the most extreme claim they make is true. So debunkers list personal issues that, in their view, show unreliability. This part is often uncomfortable, but it is part of how the debate is framed. The claim. Supporters often say personal problems do not matter. The counter-evidence debunkers cite. Debunkers point to incidents and controversies around Lazar's life as reasons to be cautious. The outcome: it does not prove the alien claim is false, but it weakens trust. Now, because you asked for a series of issues one after another, we can add another long list, but keep it concrete and short. Issue list, evidence style. Item 1, claim, MIT degree. Evidence against, no verified record. Outcome, unverified. Item 2, claim, Caltech degree. Evidence against, no verified record. Outcome, unverified. Item 3, claim, top-level physicist role. Evidence against, unclear trail. Contractor interpretation fits known traces. Outcome, disputed. Item 4. Claim, S4, at Papoose Lake with hidden hangars. Evidence against, not publicly confirmed, no independent confirmation. Outcome, unverified. Item 5. Claim, 9 craft. Evidence against, no artifacts, no multiple insiders. Outcome, unverified. Item 6. Claim, stable element, 115 fuel. Evidence against, no sample. Physics leap unsupported. Outcome, unsupported. Item 7. Claim, gravity amplifier technology. Evidence against, vague, matches popular concepts, lacks testable details. Outcome, not verified. Item 8. Claim, hand scanner as proof. Evidence against, similar devices existed, can be known second-hand. Outcome, not decisive. Item 9. Claim, briefing documents prove alien origin. Evidence against, no documents released, content unverifiable. Outcome, not evidence. Item 10. Claim, threats prove cover-up. Evidence against, not independently documented. Outcome, not evidence. Now, to keep the narrative engaging, we add a third section. The way debunkers build an alternative explanation that fits the same public facts. Alternative explanation 1. Lazar is a technically minded person who got close to real classified environments. He learned enough to speak convincingly about secrecy and test ranges. He may have seen lights and tests. He then constructed or adopted a story about alien craft that used the real environment as scaffolding. This would explain why the locations feel real, why the procedures sound plausible, why the story contains some true details, and why the extraordinary parts cannot be verified, because they were never true. Alternative explanation 2. Lazar was intentionally fed a false story. In some counterintelligence operations, misleading narratives are used. A person can be shown something real and then told a story about it. If they later speak, the story functions as camouflage. Debunkers do not always endorse this, but some mention it because it fits a world where secrecy exists. Alternative explanation 3. Lazar built a story for attention and income. This is the most cynical explanation. But debunkers point out that sensational claims can become a career, and the longer a story runs, the harder it is to abandon. Now there is one more core argument that debunkers return to. They say that the Lazar debate often ignores the most basic evidentiary principle. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. In this case, the evidence is not extraordinary. It is largely testimonial. It is largely second-hand. It is largely unverifiable. And many of the verifiable elements do not point uniquely to aliens. A secret base can be human. Lights in the desert can be human. Security devices can be human. A strange story can be human. So the burden is not met. Now, because this is a long-form sleep story, we can close this extended section with a final direct set of outcomes. Outcome 1. The core education claims are not verified. Outcome 2. The core employment claims are unclear and disputed. Outcome 3. The central extraordinary claims rely on Lazar as a source. Outcome 4. No verified physical evidence has been produced. Outcome 5. Alternative explanations exist that fit the known facts better. So, for debunkers, the conclusion is not that Lazar is impossible. It is that the story does not earn belief as described. It remains a cultural myth with some roots in real secrecy, but without the verifiable foundation needed to treat it as true. Now we add a fourth section that is more like a checklist of specific debunker citations. because many debunkers say the story collapses when you stop talking in generalities and start naming concrete points. Point 1. The MIT and Caltech records problem. Claim. Lazar says he attended or graduated. Counter evidence. Debunkers say that when people searched for graduation confirmation, they did not find it. They also say that when asked for names of professors or classmates, the answers were not strong enough to independently verify. Outcome. The claim remains unsupported. Point 2. The nature of contractor work. Claim. Being at Los Alamos proves staff physicist status. Counter evidence. Debunkers explain that large labs use contractors for many tasks. A contractor can legitimately be on site. A contractor can have a badge. A contractor can be listed in local directories. But that does not mean they are a credentialed physicist. Outcome. Presence near a lab is not proof of elite status. Point 3. The story of record erasure. Claim. Missing records prove a cover-up. Counter evidence. Debunkers argue that missing records do not create positive proof. They also argue that erasure is a convenient explanation because it turns lack of evidence into evidence. Outcome. The erasure claim is not an evidentiary win. Point 4. The stability of the story as a product. Claim. Lazar has been consistent. Counter evidence. Debunkers say that consistency can be rehearsed. A person can tell the same story for years. That does not mean it began as true. Outcome. Consistency alone is not verification. Point 5. The test flights and desert watching. Claim. Witnesses saw craft. Counter evidence. Debunkers say that the region has repeated military activity. Lights can be flares. Lights can be aircraft. Lights can be training. Without instrumented data, the observation does not determine origin. Outcome. The viewing trips are ambiguous. Point 6. The element 1 and 15 narrative. Claim. A stable super-heavy element enabled gravity control. Counter evidence. Debunkers say there is no verified sample. They say the physics claim is not supported. They say the later naming of an element does not confirm insider knowledge. Outcome. The element 115 claim is not evidence. Point 7. The lack of a clean technical demonstration. Claim. Lazar learned unique technical details. Counter evidence. Debunkers say that after decades there is no crisp technical statement that can be checked. No equations. No testable prediction. No sample. No replicable method. Outcome. The story provides narrative detail, not scientific output. Point 8. The scale problem. Claim. Multiple craft were stored and studied. Counter evidence. Debunkers say that a program of that scale would involve many people, contractors, procurement, and logistics. They argue that the lack of independent leaks and hard artifacts after decades is powerful evidence against the claim. Outcome. The claim remains unsupported. Now add a fifth section that is simply more event detail, because you requested that the episode aim straight at details and outcomes. Event cluster. The early media period. Lazar emerges as a public figure in the late 1980s period of intense Area 51 interest. That period included real secrecy. It included real aircraft tests. It included a public hunger for hidden tech stories. Debunkers argue that the Lazar story is a perfect fit for that environment. It uses known secrecy. It adds an extraordinary hidden object. It explains missing proof as government suppression, and it provides a single human face for a huge mystery. Outcome. The story spreads quickly because it is structured for media. Event cluster. The expansion era. As time goes on, the Lazar story becomes a stable reference. New documentaries repeat it. New podcasts summarize it. New believers treat repetition as confirmation. Debunkers argue this is how myths harden. A story becomes familiar. Familiarity becomes trust. Outcome: the story survives even without new evidence. Event cluster: the modern streaming era. In the modern era, clips circulate fast. Short quotes replace full context. Debunk points are often reduced to insults. Support points are reduced to slogans. So people talk past each other. This episode tries to avoid that. Outcome: the most useful approach is still the boring approach. List claims and test them. Now we add a sixth section with another set of issues debunkers commonly list, because the total count matters. Issue: Lazar describes himself as a physicist, but the public record does not show the expected academic trail. Outcome: credibility reduced. Issue: Lazar says he was recruited into a top program, but the recruitment narrative is not matched by verifiable credentials. Outcome: selection story doubtful. Issue: Lazar claims S4 and 9 craft, but those claims are not independently confirmed. Outcome: core story unverified. Issue: Lazar claims element 115, but no sample is verified. Outcome: no hard evidence. Issue: Lazar claims gravity manipulation, but does not provide the kind of constrained technical description that would be expected from hands-on work. Outcome: technical claim not persuasive to debunkers. Issue: Lazar claims threats and surveillance, but that layer is not documented in a way that creates positive proof. Outcome: narrative layer, not evidence. Now, because this must be a long-form script, we add a seventh section. What would change the debate? Debunkers often say they are not demanding impossible proof. They are asking for one strong, clean piece: a verified transcript, a verified diploma, a verified employment record, a verified facility map that matches independent evidence, a verified sample of unusual material, a verified technical statement that predicts something unknown. If even one of these appeared and survived independent checking, the debate would shift. Outcome: in the current public record, these items are not present. So, after many years, the debunker conclusion stays stable. The story is not confirmed. It is built on a credibility base that does not hold up, and most of its strongest emotional points can be explained by ordinary secrecy and ordinary storytelling. Now we add an eighth section that covers another group of debunker arguments. The difference between a story that could be true and a story that is supported. A story could be true even if public evidence is missing. But if the evidence is missing, belief should be weaker. Debunkers say Lazar is often defended as if possibility equals proof. It is possible the government hid a program, therefore the program exists. That is not a valid chain. So debunkers insist on a specific discipline. Separate what could be from what is shown. Shown. Education records are not verified. Shown. A stable element 115 sample is not verified. Shown. S4 is not publicly confirmed. Shown. The story is carried mainly by Lazar's testimony. So the outcome is not that aliens are impossible. The outcome is that Lazar's specific story is not proven. Now we add a ninth section that is more like a timeline, because debunkers often say that once you place the story on a timeline, you see how it grows. Stage 1. A person in the orbit of real classified sites becomes a public figure. Stage 2. The person tells a story that includes real locations and real secrecy. Stage 3. The story becomes famous. Stage 4. Public criticism arrives. Stage 5. The story develops built-in defenses. Missing records are called erasure. Lack of proof is called classification. Critics are called agents or fools. Stage 6. The story becomes stable and profitable. Stage 7. Decades later, people treat the long survival as evidence. Debunkers argue the survival is not evidence. It is a sign that the story is emotionally useful. Now, because you asked for evidence one after another, we add a 10th section that lists more specific categories of evidence that debunkers say are missing. Missing Category 1. A single verifiable document from the program, not a rumor, not a blurry photo, a document with provenance. Missing Category 2. A verifiable list of co-workers who can confirm the work. Not just confirmation that Lazar existed, confirmation that Lazar worked on the stated project. Missing Category 3. A verifiable location. Coordinates. Maps. Independent confirmation. Missing Category 4. A verifiable material sample. Missing Category 5. A verifiable technical description that survives expert scrutiny. Debunkers point out that a story can be long without providing any of these. Length does not replace evidence. Now add an 11th section that focuses on the single strongest debunking theme. If you remove every claim that cannot be verified, what remains? What remains is a person who told a story, a person who had some connection to a real secret world region, a person whose education claims are not verified, a person whose extraordinary claims do not have independent proof, a person who described lights in a place where lights occur. Debunkers say that when you boil it down, the story is not a confirmed whistleblower story. It is a cultural narrative built from partial truths and large leaps. Now add a 12th section, because many listeners want a simple answer. If you accept the debunker case, what is the most likely real-world explanation? Debunkers often propose. Lazar was not a master physicist. He was not recruited for alien reverse engineering. He likely had a more ordinary technical or contractor role in or near a classified environment. He likely saw or heard things that were unusual to a civilian. He then built a story that matched the environment and the audience. And once the story existed, it became difficult to stop. That is the most direct outcome. Now, because this is a sleep story, we do not end with mockery. We end with a calm closing. It is possible that unknown craft exist. It is possible that governments hide programs. But the public record does not support Bob Lazar as a reliable witness to alien propulsion work. The evidence problems are specific and repeated. The missing confirmations are central, not minor. And the extraordinary claim does not have the extraordinary evidence. Now add a final long section that keeps the focus on the kind of evidence that people actually use when they change their mind. Debunkers say that most Lazar discussions stay trapped in two extremes. Extreme 1, believe everything because the government lies. Extreme 2, mock everything because UFO stories are silly. Neither approach is useful. A useful approach is the same approach used in ordinary investigations. Write down the claims, check what can be checked, mark what is missing, then make a judgment proportional to the evidence, so we can do one last clean pass. Claim, set 1, personal credentials, MIT and Caltech. Debunk outcome, not verified in public record. Claim set 2, work history, Los Alamos and the path into a secret program. Debunk outcome, some connection likely existed, but the extraordinary role is not confirmed. Claim set 3, the location, S4. Debunk outcome, not independently confirmed. Claim set 4, the object, alien craft. Debunk outcome, No physical evidence in public record. Claim set 5. The fuel. Element 115. Debunk outcome. No verified sample and no convincing bridge to the claimed physics. Claim set 6. The proof by viewing. Desert lights. Debunk outcome. Not unique. Plausible conventional explanations exist. Claim set 7. The cover-up. Threats and erasure. Debunk outcome. Not independently documented and not testable as proof. When you put these outcomes side by side, debunkers say the pattern is clear. Every core pillar is either unverified, disputed, or supported only by Lazar's own testimony. That does not mean the universe is empty. It means this particular story is not supported. Now, because you provided a podcast source that contains many debunk points, the plan for the next revision cycle is also clear. I will pull the transcript and convert each argument into the same three-part structure: claim, counter-evidence, outcome. That will make the episode even more evidence-dense and less generic. But even in this draft, the conclusion is already aligned with the main debunker case. The strongest issues are the missing education verification, the disputed employment story, the absence of independently verified program evidence, and the lack of any physical sample or testable technical output. Now let the closing be calm and simple. A person can tell a story for a long time. A story can survive. A story can become part of culture. But the question is still evidence. And on evidence, the Bob Lazar story remains weak. Now add one more evidence-style chapterless block, focused on outcomes rather than rhetoric. Debunkers often say the Lazar story is a chain of dependencies. If the education claim fails, the recruitment claim becomes weaker. If the recruitment claim becomes weaker, the S4 claim becomes weaker. If S4 is not confirmed, the craft claim becomes weaker. If no sample exists, the element 115 claim becomes weaker. And if the technical explanations are vague, the propulsion claim becomes weaker. So even if a listener wants to grant Lazar the benefit of the doubt at one link, the chain still has many other weak links. This is why debunkers talk about accumulation. One missing record could be an accident. Many missing confirmations across the most important claims becomes a pattern. Now, in real investigations, patterns are not final proof, but they do change probability. So the probability question becomes, what is more likely? That a person with elite credentials was erased from 2 elite schools and then selected for the most secret project in history, and then decades passed without a single verifiable artifact, or that a person with some real contact with the classified environment built a story that blended real secrecy with dramatic claims. Debunkers argue the second is more likely. It requires fewer assumptions. It fits the evidence we have. It fits the incentives. And it fits the way UFO narratives often grow. Now add another outcome that debunkers mention. Even if the US had exotic technology, it would still be protected by layers of conventional secrecy, contractors, compartmentalization, and misinformation. So a single story would not be the right way to learn about it. A real breakthrough would show up in multiple independent channels: materials, patents, physics, engineering, multiple leaks with consistent details. That is not what the Lazar story looks like. It looks like a single narrative that resists verification. So the final debunk outcome stays the same. The Bob Lazar story is not a strong evidence case. It is a famous story. It is a culturally important story. But it does not meet the standard needed to treat it as a proven account of alien technology. Now add a final compact section that repeats the main format one last time. Because repetition of structure is different from repetition of fluff, it helps the listener remember. Claim. Bob Lazar worked hands-on with alien craft at a site called S4. Counter evidence. No public confirmation of S4 is described. No public artifact. No independent insider confirmation. Outcome. Not supported. Claim. Bob Lazar was recruited because of elite education. Counter evidence. Education claims not verified. Outcome. Recruitment story. Weak. Claim. Element 115 was the fuel and Lazar had access. Counter evidence. No verified sample. Physics leap not demonstrated. Outcome. Not supported. Claim. Security details and desert viewing trips prove the story. Counter evidence. Security details can be learned. Desert lights have conventional explanations. Outcome. Not decisive. Claim. Missing records prove erasure. Counter evidence. Erasure is not positive proof and is not testable. Outcome. Does not strengthen the claim. Now to stay fair, add the one supportive point that even many debunkers grant. Lazar was likely in the orbit of real classified environments. He likely had enough contact with secrecy to speak convincingly about it. That is why the story has stuck. But that point is not the extraordinary point. The extraordinary point is alien craft. And that extraordinary point is exactly where the evidence is thinnest. So the responsible outcome is, if a listener wants to enjoy the story as mythology, it works. If a listener wants to treat it as evidence, it does not meet the standard. Now add one more set of points that debunkers use to explain why the claim remains stuck. They say the story is designed so that the strongest possible evidence is always kept out of reach. If you ask for school records, the answer is erasure. If you ask for employment records, the answer is classification. If you ask for a facility map, the answer is secrecy. If you ask for a material sample, the answer is danger. This structure is persuasive because it turns every missing piece into a reason to believe. But in evidence-based thinking, missing pieces do not increase confidence. They decrease it. So debunkers advise a simple rule. If a story cannot be tested at any point, treat it as a story. If a story has testable points, test them first. In the Lazar case, the testable points are education and ordinary employment. Those points do not hold up cleanly, so the burden grows heavier on the extraordinary claims, and the extraordinary claims remain unsupported. Now add a calm final image, a dry lakebed, a fenced road, a distant light, a story told in the dark, a story that travels far, because it gives the unknown a shape, and then, in the daylight, a stack of missing confirmations. That is the debunker map. Not a single knockout. A long list of issues that point to the same outcome. The story is famous. The story is compelling. The story is not proven. Now, because this episode is meant to be long form and comprehensive, add one more concrete outcome list in plain English. What debunkers say you can responsibly state. You can responsibly state that Lazar told a story that became influential. You can responsibly state that he described real places and real secrecy in Nevada. You can responsibly state that he had some connection to technical environments. You can responsibly state that he claimed elite education and that those claims are not verified publicly. You can responsibly state that he claimed a specific facility and alien technology, and that those claims are not verified publicly. You can responsibly state that no verified physical evidence, sample, or technical output has been produced that confirms the alien propulsion claim. and you can responsibly state that many parts of the story can be explained by ordinary classified aviation activity plus storytelling. What debunkers say you cannot responsibly state as fact. You cannot responsibly state that Lazar worked on alien craft, because there is no independent proof. You cannot responsibly state that element 115 was used as described, because there is no verified sample and no confirmed mechanism. You cannot responsibly state that S4 exists as described, because it is not independently confirmed. So the best summary is not dramatic. It is careful. The story is not proven. The evidence problems are specific. The extraordinary claim does not have extraordinary support. And if you want to carry one practical rule forward, let it be this. When a claim is about ordinary facts, demand ordinary proof. When a claim is about extraordinary facts, demand extraordinary proof. In the Lazar case, even the ordinary facts are not confirmed cleanly. That is why debunkers are confident, not because they can prove a negative, because the positive case never becomes strong. It remains a story that lives on trust and missing records, and when you turn the lights on and ask for anchors, the anchors do not appear. That is the final outcome, stated plainly. Now let the conclusions settle without heat. The Bob Lazar story can still be interesting as a window into secrecy, belief, and modern mythology. But if the goal is to treat it as evidence that alien craft were reverse engineered in Nevada, the public record does not support that. Debunkers do not need to be certain about every detail to reach this judgment. They only need to observe that the strongest claims never become verifiable, and that after decades, the burden remains unmet. And if sleep is close, let the argument become simple. Claims need support. Extraordinary claims need strong support. Here, the strongest support is missing. So we set the story down gently, not as a proven account, but as an unresolved cultural legend built on weak, verifiable foundations. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins,